Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way. This is a podcast for serious writers who want to develop their skills in artistry and stand out in a crowded industry by taking intelligent, creative risks. I'm your host, Jonathan Ball. I hold a PhD in literature. I'm the author of numerous books, and I take a very analytical approach to art making, emphasizing both efficiency and experimentation. It's late at night, and I can't sleep, and I have some whiskey and some Crown Royal. It's a great Canadian rye whiskey, and I thought I would record a podcast for you where I answer questions. I had asked people to ask me questions with the idea that in a future podcast I would answer some questions. So that's what I'm going to do today. So all sorts of different questions that have come from you, my listeners. And, people connect with me on social media and, on the interwebs, as they put it. I'm going to answer your questions. These are the things you've been dying to hear, the best questions that people asked me. So I'm just going to kind of run through the questions and see, how it goes. Finally get to, maybe your question, the thing you've been dying to know. I've got a couple of repeat customers, people who have asked multiple questions, and it's a real gamut of topics here, so I think we'll kind of just dive into it shortly. But first I want to just say I've got a book coming out this fall, as I've mentioned previously on podcasts, and that I don't remember if I've said the name of that book, but the book I've got coming out is called The National Gallery. It's kind of an unusual title for the book, I know. I should maybe just say something about the title, which is that I don't think many people know this, but years and years ago, I was in a bar with Derek Beaulieu, the concrete poet, and we were in Calgary in a bar sitting there and just kind of, hanging out. And I had, at that point, I can't remember exactly. I think I had just published The Politics of Knives. I think I was touring through Calgary with The Politics of Knives, if I recall correctly. So it was not when I lived there, but when I was touring back there. And Derek noted, he said, he goes, "You've got a book, Ex Machina," he said, which in many ways, he said, I think is a book about books. He's like, and then you've got this book, Clockfire, which of course is a book about the theater. Now you've got this book of poems about, The Politics of Knives, which he said in many ways is about the film, about film as a medium, and, the sort of violence and film. And he said, I expect your next book, should be about the visual arts. You should do a kind of round out the quadrilogy or the tetralogy, I suppose, would be the actual quadrilogy is what the Alien films are. I have a DVD set upstairs. This is where that word came from. Quadrilogy doesn't exist. The word is tetralogy, but of course nobody knows the word tetralogy. So when they marketed the DVD of the first 4 Alien films, the DVD set, they called it the quadrilogy. And I always say that name in sort of a private jest. Anyway, but I was thinking what Derek had said. Of course, there's other art forms like music, for example. Maybe I have to write a book of poetry about music before I'm done with poetry. But I was thinking about that. It got in my head, and I thought years and years and years ago, maybe, I should have my next book about visual art in a certain way. And that book has really evolved from that initial idea. It's a very kind of complicated book that in many ways is about being a dad more than it is about visual art. But I think broadly speaking, it is about art and about poetry and about what they matter in the private arena of your own life and what they matter in this public space. And anyway, what Derek had said about visual art got in my head, and this question of what does art matter in our lives and in our nation, especially in an age now when we still have nations, but I think we're very suspicious of nationalism, even more so than maybe we might have been in the past. I think that it's an interesting set of questions that kind of revolve around something iconic like the National Gallery of Canada. So anyway, all this is a long way of saying, for some reason, the National Gallery did not buy the website, thenationalgallery.ca. I just was like Googling around for like website domains, and just with the idea, I wonder if there's anything like thenationalgallery.com available. Of course, that won't be available, I thought to myself. And it wasn't, but for some reason, the nationalgallery.ca is available. So it's the nationalgallery.ca. And if you go to the nationalgallery.ca, right now I just forwarded it to a page where you can get like information about my book, and you can pre-order it if you like. Later on, though, I'll do something cool with that website address. So if you have ideas for what should be at the nationalgallery.ca, I just want to do something cool and weird to, just to tie into the book somehow. I'll figure it out this summer. But right now you can go there if you like. As I say, you can go there, thenationalgallery.ca, and find out more about the book. But if you have ideas for what I could do with that website, let me know. Just send me an email. I'm jonathan@jonathanball.com. Jonathan@jonathanball.com. So that is my kind of question to you. What should I do with the nationalgallery.ca? And now let's hear your questions for me. Now the first question comes from Winnipeg writer Carmelo Militano, and he asks, to eat or not eat chips is the question, especially ketchup chips. Now, chips are my 100% favorite food. I love chips. I'm obsessed with chips. If you know me well, you will, know my chip obsession. You will have seen me eat a bag of chips, most likely, or at least heard me talk about chips or whatever. So I could talk about chips all day. Of course, you should eat chips. To eat or not eat chips is the question. It's not really a question, Carmelo. You should eat chips. Chips are amazing. I could do without chocolate. I could quit sugar if I really needed to. I could quit anything. But chips, man, I love chips. I love them so much. If I have them in my house, I'll eat them all. In fact, I just finished a bag of chips, before I started recording this podcast. But, so the second part of your question, Carmelo, to eat or not eat chips is the question. Yes, eat chips, especially ketchup chips. I will say this is an unpopular opinion, especially amongst Canadians. The one type of chip, I don't like two types of chips, okay? There are two chip flavors that I've ever had that I did not like. Two chips flavors of the common ones. So one is dill pickle chips. I do not like dill pickle chips, but I will eat them. I don't like them at all. Honestly, this is how much I like chips. I like chips so much that I will eat chips that I don't like at all because they're chips. So if I'm at a party and there's like dill pickle chips there, like somebody else is eating the rest of the chips, it's only dill pickle chips, I'll stand by that dill pickle chips bowl and I'll like eat the dill pickle chips all night, but I don't like them. I don't like one bite of the chips, but I love biting chips, so I'll just eat them. But ketchup chips, I won't touch. They're the only chip that I do not like. Ketchup chips. Hate them. I don't like ketchup, first off. I think ketchup is for the weak. When I grew up, I ate ketchup only when I was trying to smother the taste of something my parents had cooked that I didn't like. That's sort of my association with ketchup from childhood. It was a thing I would put on food I didn't like. So when I grew up, I never liked ketchup. I do not like ketchup. I think it's disgusting. Nothing about it appeals to me. I think it's the best way to ruin a burger or a hot dog is to put ketchup on it. And the only way you can ruin chips for me is to put ketchup flavoring on them. Ketchup chips are the worst. I would rather not eat chips than eat ketchup chips. But every other chip I'll eat, including chips I don't actually like. So that's Carmelo Militano's question about, or double-part question about chips. So my next question is from Dave Barber, who is another Winnipegger. He is actually the programmer of the Winnipeg Cinematheque and a sort of local, legend in the arts scene here. And Dave Barber asks, why is Old Dutch the best chips? Well, so if you know Old Dutch chips, of course, there's different types of Old Dutch chips now. But Dave, you know why Old Dutch is the best chips. It's because they come in a cardboard box. They come in a cardboard box. That's why Old Dutch is the best chips. They're not my favorite chips, I'll point out. I do think they are probably the best chips, honestly. And I do love them. But especially one of my favorite chip flavors of all time is the onion and garlic Old Dutch chips, the non-ripple ones, like the kind of flat ones. Oh, man, they're so amazing. Although I don't like onions, but I do love that chip flavor. But my favorite chips of all time, if I had to pick one chip to eat for the rest of my life, I gotta say my favorite chips are not Old Dutch, unfortunately. Although of course, I love Old Dutch. Any sane person would. But my favorite chips are Lay's brand. Just junk food Lay's. Specifically the sea salt and pepper chips. Sea salt and pepper Lay's are my absolute favorite. Probably right after that is my daughter's favorite chip. It's probably my second favorite chip, which is a Miss Vicky's. Again, like kind of a pepper chip, cracked pepper chip. I forget the precise term that they use in the Vicky's bag, but that kind of peppery flavor one is her favorite. And again, it'd be my second favorite. My third favorite chip is straight up Doritos. Doritos nacho cheese. And then down from there, it would probably be, actually right above the Doritos nacho cheese would be Ruffles sour cream and bacon, which is a chip I loved from childhood. Now, I would take an Old Dutch over, those chips some days, but Old Dutch would be right under my top favorite chips. I also do like Pringles sour cream and onion. I've got to say, I'm not a huge Pringles fan in terms of their other flavors. I like the plain. I like the sour cream and sour cream and onion. But that's sort of my kind of ladder. So I do concede to you, Dave, that Old Dutch are probably the best chips. If you were objectively looking at things, subjectively, I just they're in my top, 10 for sure. I would be a few different Old Dutch flavors. But I didn't grow up in Winnipeg, so I don't have the emotional attachment to Old Dutch. But I do, of course, remember and still have a fondness for the boxes. So I would say, if you're looking for a reason Old Dutch are the best chips, the boxes. Now, another question from another Winnipegger. This is from Candace Jean Ball, who is actually not related to me, which is funny because I don't know really anybody named Ball who is related to me. It's kind of a weird quirk. Candace Jean Ball writes, why are Canadian ketchup chips superior to American? So that's her first question. She has two questions. Now, I'll just answer that first question to start with. Candace, I don't eat ketchup chips, so I can't answer that question. I'm sorry. But if I had to guess at the answer, why are Canadian ketchup chips superior to American ketchup chips? I would say that the brands are probably, again, Old Dutch being a sort of brand that I think we can all concede is pretty much amazing. I mean, they just obviously are making the best ketchup chip. I've had a few ketchup chips, and of course they're making the best one. I just don't like ketchup chips, and I don't like their chips either. I still wouldn't eat them personally if I had a choice. But I have eaten them under duress from time to time, and I will concede they are better than American ketchup chips. I just think it's hard, like Canadians care about their ketchup chips, and Americans don't. Not my thing, but, I think that's the reason. And her second question that kind of is connected to this is a two-part question. Second question is, what lessons can Americans learn from Old Dutch? Well, again, the boxes are a big lesson. There's just something about getting a box of chips and then inside there's 2 bags of chips. So it's like you buy one thing of chips, but you get 2 things of chips. It's just brilliant, It's a great, packaging setup. I just, it was always the great problem of chips, of course, is you open a bag and like now that you've opened that bag, you eat them all. Old Dutch solved that problem. You get a box, you open the box, you eat one bag, and then you have another bag in the box still, sealed up, fresh, nice. They just figured out how to present the chip to you. I mean, of course they're good chips, but that was the thing. I think Americans, anytime you go to the States and you eat in a restaurant, they just give you too much food. And I think it's just part of that whole zeitgeist, whatever you want to call it, that whole just way of thinking. Old Dutch is the Canadian sort of way. Maybe less so now, but that Canada started to really do this in restaurants in the last few decades. But used to be, they want to just overload your plate, and Old Dutch doesn't overload your palate. Now, next we have a literary question. Helen Hajnowski, who is another writer who wrote a great, she's written a number of books that are great, but I really like Poets and Killers. Poets and Killers, a really excellent book. It kind of tells the story of a guy, his from like birth to death, if I recall, but the entire in poetry, but the poems were all constructed of advertisements that were in existence in that person in that year. So in the year of his life, in that stage of his life, here's the advertising language from that period. Really brilliant little fun book. Helen Hajnowski, she's really great. Her other books are good too, but that's the one I have a real fondness for. Helen Hajnowski writes, I have a literary question. What type of chips are the least likely to leave grease stains on books? Okay, I did some tests for you, Helen. And of course, I didn't need to do the test. I could have just thought through it in retrospect. But chips that are least likely to leave grease stains on books are the baked chips. Not the fried ones, but the baked ones. So you want to, if you're concerned about your grease stains on your books, you want to go for oven-baked Lay's. And similar, kinds of oven-baked chips. In a pinch, if you can't find an oven-baked chip, or you just don't like oven-baked chips, in a pinch, go with plain Pringles. Pringles are fried, but they're not really like cut. They're kind of made out of a weird pressed slurry, rather than, I don't know. It's kind of an odd way they make Pringles, but as a result, they aren't as saturated. Although they are fried, they're not as oil saturated as other types of chips. If you're talking, of course, about the plain Pringles that don't have coating on them. Pringles is really bad for getting the coating all like uneven and thick and so on. So if it's got coating, stay away from Pringles. Generally speaking, that's a good thing if you're talking about the books. But baked chips, like oven-baked Lay's, would be my number one pick for that. Keep your books free of grease stains. Number 2 would be original plain Pringles. Now, let's get off the chips for a second. They're not all questions about chips. I know what you're thinking. They're not all about chips. We're going to kind of move into some other questions now. I just wanted to front load it with the chips because they are kind of the most important things. The topic people are asking me the most about is chips. But Doug MacArthur has a question. Doug, by the way, and I used to share an office at the University of Winnipeg. I started a magazine at the University of Winnipeg that is kind of, I basically they were putting an ad in the Arts Student Body Council, had an ad for a guy to come in and run their newsletter. They kind of like were publishing a little newsletter every now and again. And I went into the job interview and said, look, a newsletter is a stupid idea. People want newsletters, they'll go to your website. You can update the information on there quicker and, more frequently and so on. Or you can even, get them on an email list or something. It's an idiotic idea to run a newsletter. I'm like, what you should do instead is let me take the budget, and instead of printing a newsletter every 2-3 weeks or whatever, I'll just like once or twice a year I'll publish a literary magazine. And they basically agreed to it. Is a short story. Eventually, that thing I call it the Maelstrom. Because I had a dream where I had written a book and I was reading the book in the dream. So in the dream, I had a stack of manuscript pages and I was just reading this manuscript I had written, and in the dream. And it was amazing. It was like, this is amazing. It's the best thing I've ever written. It's incredible. And I was just reading it page after page in the dream. And I thought to myself, oh my God, I was aware it was a dream. I thought to myself, oh my God, I just have to wake up and like write this down and it will be amazing. It's an amazing book. And so I woke up and I struggled and I grabbed a piece of paper and I wrote down something. I was like, I'll just write a little bit and then I'll remember in the morning because I got to go back to sleep. So I wrote something down and I went back to sleep. When I woke up again in the morning, I remembered all this. I remembered that I had this dream and everything. And I thought, oh, I've got that piece of paper. As soon as I look at this paper and see what I've written on it, it'll all flash back to me, and I'll just sit down and transcribe out this dream novel I wrote. I picked up the piece of paper and I turned it over, and it said Maelstrom. That's all it said, just the word Maelstrom. And I looked at it, and it triggered no memories, no associations, nothing. I looked up the word in the dictionary just in case there was some weird secondary meaning I didn't know or something, and thinking, well, maybe this will unlock it. Nope. No clue why I wrote Maelstrom down. Don't know what that book was all about in my dream, nothing. In any case, I decided to call this journal that I made the Maelstrom, and Doug was my office mate, and we worked on the Maelstrom together. Eventually, it became a real literary publication. John Stintsey, who is another writer, was running it for a while. At this point, they've transitioned it over to the Arts Tribune, they call it. They changed the name, and it's called the Arts Tribune. But it is still really the Maelstrom, this literary magazine that I started when it's not like now a professional publication. When I was doing it, I literally was like stapling, saddle stitching and stapling like a zine together. It was pretty kind of funny. Anyway, Doug asks 2 questions. So his first question is, where do lost socks go? Well, there are a lot of theories about lost socks, Doug. If you're talking about the lost socks in the dryer, of course, there's a lot of theories about that. You can look online and find where people think. A lot of people believe they get sucked into vents or into different ducts and chambers connected to the dryer. My belief is that they never make it into the dryer. You just think they're in the dryer, but they're not. But you've lost them around the house or thrown them out and forgotten about them, and so on and so forth. But of course, those are all just theories. And everybody's got a different idea about where lost socks go. But I've got the real answer: heaven. And Doug has another question. Doug MacArthur also asks, is a hot dog a sandwich? Well, Doug, you may think the hot dog is a sandwich, and there's a good argument to be made that the hot dog is a sandwich. I would say no, hot dog is not a sandwich because the bun is one piece rather than 2 pieces. So your bread is basically it's like making an open-faced sandwich. Like a hot dog, you could argue, is a variant of an open-faced sandwich. But I would instead go with what the National Hot Dog and Sausage Council say. There was an official press release sent out from the National Hot Dog and Sausage Council. This is a real thing, and it declared that the hot dog is not a sandwich. And according to the council, quote, their verdict is that a hot dog is an exclamation of joy, a food, a verb describing showing off, and even an emoji. It is truly a category unto its own, end quote. So I would agree with that. And I would also quibble that open-faced sandwiches are not sandwiches, and hot dogs are not sandwiches. I'm going to have another sip of my whiskey here as I, scroll down and try to find a new question for you. Daryl Wetter has a question. Daryl Wetter is a poet who wrote a book about pornography. These really great little poems, like an ode to the various pornographic materials and so on. Really interesting book. If I'm recalling correctly, unless I'm mixing the name up, I'm pretty sure that was Daryl Wetter, and he has a great question. This is a more serious, more literary question. Well, still, I guess, same level of seriousness. These are serious questions: the chips questions, the hot dog question, and so on. These aren't. These are things people need to know. But here's the question: in literary fiction, how interchangeable are plot and character? Daryl, this is a hard question to answer, but I would go to the technical answer. How interchangeable are plot and character? Well, so let me just, first note for people who may not be familiar, like the root of this question. There is an argument that various literary theorists / narratologists, people who study stories or who write about how to write, craft and so on, there's an argument to be made, or that is sometimes made, that plot and character are somewhat interchangeable. For example, the character, takes actions, and those actions reveal that person's character. That's how you build a character. You show us their actions. Of course, their thoughts and their words come into play, but the argument goes that their actions tell us, truly who they are under duress. And then, of course, there is the same argument made for plot. A plot is, you taking your characters, putting them under duress, seeing what they do. It's this causal chain of events, and it's driven by characters. So different arguments exist about whether or not characters and plot are distinct or fundamentally intermingled and the same. And a lot of these arguments, of course, connect to whether or not we should distinguish between genre fiction and literary fiction. My argument would be that literary fiction is a genre. It's a sort of Joyce in its modern form. It's sort of, in many respects, comes from Joyce, but it's just as a genre that prioritizes internal conflict rather than, say, external conflict, which so-called commercial genre works tend to emphasize instead. But putting all that stuff aside, I would argue that they are distinct, and the reason is that they're partly interchangeable, but also partly distinct. And the reason I would argue is I'm really a formalist, and I feel I'm very much a technician. That's how I like to think about myself as a writer. I'm perhaps not a great writer in some respects, but I'm a technician. I can tell you what I'm doing. I can do it. I can take the thing apart. I can explain to you what I'm doing in a way that is clinical. I try to be mindful of that when I write, and to still kind of, be emotive and visceral, because I think, I can potentially move away from that and get too cold and clinical and technical if I were not paying attention to what I was doing. But I would go right down to brass tacks and remind you that there's different arguments with this, but I think broadly speaking, it's true that you have 5 narrative modes. What I mean by that is, broadly speaking, it's somewhat accepted, and I think it is true to a degree that there's really only 5 things you can write in fiction. 5 things you can write. You can write action. Characters are doing things happen, objects happen. You can write dialogue. You can write thought. You can write description. And you can write exposition, which we sometimes think of as pure narration. But if there's 5 narrative modes, roughly, action, dialogue, thought, description, exposition, those are the things you can write. Plot and character are not a thing you can write. Like, they're an outgrowth of you having written those things, right? So a character is the sum of their action, their dialogue, their thought, and then descriptions. Exposition does not connect to character, right? Generally speaking. Whereas a plot is the sum of the action, to some degree the dialogue, and the exposition. A character's thought, does not really connect to plot. Description does not really connect to plot. So, action and dialogue is where plot and character overlap. And then, we continue to build character with thought and description. We continue to build the plot through exposition. So, I would say they're not interchangeable, but there is, a great, half of it, if not more than half of it, is the same thing. George Tolles asks a question. George Tolles was my master's. It was the first professor that I really loved at university. I had other professors I really liked a lot. He was the first professor I, just really got me interested in doing the things that I, kind of went on to do. And he was extremely passionate and encouraging of my writing. So George, if you're listening to this, thank you. You're my favorite professor in university, and he's just a great, very supportive person in my life. And George is a film professor at the University of Manitoba, but he also is a writer himself. And he's best known as the screenwriter of a number of Guy Maddin's movies. Although he just published a book on Paul Thomas Anderson, which is really great. I'd encourage you to get a hold of if you have any interest in Paul Thomas Anderson. George, wrote the book on him, George Tolles. But otherwise, again, he's written other screenplays, but he's best known probably for writing with/for Guy Maddin, director Guy Maddin. And George asks a somewhat mournful question: why don't movies matter anymore? Why don't movies matter anymore? I think that what George is asking here is, why don't they matter the way they used to in the cultural conversation? So if I misunderstand your question, I apologize, George, but I think that's what you're after is, that movies used to really be a part of the cultural. Books used to be, of course, a massive part of the cultural conversation, and then it kind of shifted to movies in many respects, and now it's moved on, right? It's moved on in many ways to television rather than movies, and you could even argue, I think, make a good argument that it's moved on to games in many respects. But I would say I think that movies still matter in certain ways, but maybe the wrong movies matter. Not to denigrate popular movies by any means necessarily. I mean, some of them are quite excellent on certain terms or on their own terms. But broadly speaking, I would say that, I mean, George, you could probably tell me better than I could. I'm going to speculate a little bit here because I'm not a scholar of this the way that maybe you or somebody else would be. But I would say there's sort of two things that added together have caused a problem. I would say that one, you have a trend towards tentpole franchises, right? These massive, $100 million plus movies. I think that are designed to be franchises. I think that trend has been damaging, and it is an outcome, I think, of a different trend, which is the trend towards media fragmentation. The fact that I like to say that there's no mainstream anymore. It used to be when I was in school, that there was a mainstream and then there was a counterculture, right? I don't think that's really the truth anymore. I don't think the mainstream exists in the same way that it used to. And what I mean by that is just we don't all do the same things anymore. Like it used to be that you could count on common knowledge. Like when I teach classes, I find this a big problem actually. It used to be I could walk into a classroom and assume that everybody had a certain level of common knowledge. They all knew who Hitler was. They all knew what the Cold War was in a basic way. They all knew, who Adam and Eve were, right? They all knew this same handful of things. Maybe it wasn't a large amount of things. You'd have to explain a lot of things. But now, because of, media fragmentation, when I grew up also, keep in mind, like there were like 3 TV channels or something. Like, it was not the same world. And of course, you've also got an increasing globalization in the last, number of years. I think, anyways, case you've had this media fragmentation where we don't all have common knowledge, and to deal with that requires a massive marketing budget. And I think that this has caused, to some degree, the trend towards these tentpole franchises. I think what has happened as a result of those two factors is it's all but eliminated middle-range budgets. So your sort of $40 million movie, I don't know if it really exists in the same way it used to, or $30 million movie, $20 million movies. I don't feel like that category is as large as it was. And it certainly is not, your $10 million movies, are virtually non-existent as I understand it. I mean, maybe you can correct me on this. I haven't looked this up statistically, and I may be wrong about these things. But I feel like that sort of spot between like 10 to 50 million, nobody's making movies in those spots anymore, from what I understand. And so you have, these massive, I think once you're over like 50 million or, you're in the like 80, 100, 200, $300 million movies, you can't take creative risks at that point. I don't feel like, those movies sometimes do take creative risks, but it's very difficult, right? And you can understand why. On the other side of the scale, the smaller kind of independent studios with the smaller budgets that maybe are doing, maybe can, on another level, may seem positioned to take a lot of risks, but I think, are also in this, for the wrong other side of the problem. They're not spending a ton of money, but that's all the money they've got to spend. Again, even those movies to get real exposure require, even those movies tend to be risk averse, as at least in some cases. And when they're not risk averse, when they are very risky, again, they still require these massive marketing budgets. And it's not unusual, I don't think, anymore for an independent film to just, despite the fact that there's so much distribution it could get, basically not be able to acquire a meaningful distribution. I was just talking to a guy, I won't say who he is, or give enough information to identify him, because he was, having a problem. But he's, a screenwriter who's got some hits behind him, mild, independent kind of hits in the horror film world behind him. He's got a director who actually is one of the large, well-known directors in Canada, who's had, again, great storied career, books written about his work and so on. He's got stars, but they're not A-listers, right? But recognizable actors with cult followings and multiple ones and so on. It's got film is done, shot in the can, cut together, touring some festivals. Still having problems with getting distribution. And of course, there's options now that there never used to be in terms of distribution. But as you know, George, getting people into the theater is the big problem. In some ways, it's harder than making these movies. And I always used to say back in the day when Telefilm had decided they were going to start their star system, I don't know where I once had an argument with Telefilm, or with a guy at Telefilm. I forget his name now, but at that time, I don't know what Telefilm's at with this at the moment. They seem to have shifted around in their thinking. But at the time, Telefilm had kind of announced they were going to try to build a star system in Canada. That was, the big problem. These movies didn't have stars. Where to build our own star system. And I remember talking to this guy and saying, you can't build a star system in Canada. Any star will just move to the States. Why would they? Why wouldn't they? At the time, they were very focused on, trying to, again, move the budgets up to get larger stars and so on, and do fewer movies and so on. And I had been making the argument to this guy that it should really give guys like, George Tolles and Guy Maddin more money, because these are the movies that kind of travel outside the country, although maybe, not in doing the numbers that they would like to do. But in any case, long story short, I think the problem is a marketing problem. I don't think it's that. I think that movies not mattering anymore in the cultural conversation is a material effect of shifts in the industry. I don't think it has much to do with the films themselves, or even with the cultural interest in films. And so for this reason, I'm hopeful that, you'll have some future shifts that'll just bring movies back into the cultural attention. I don't think it's the fault of the movies in many respects, is what I'm trying to say. I think it's this sort of industry shifts that have made it harder for even a large film with the big money to get attention. And I think it's not a case necessarily of the culture being unwilling to pay attention to these movies. I think it's just a matter of you just don't have the numbers of people watching the same movie anymore. And once that can shift around again, which I think it easily could, if we just get the distribution figured out and the marketing figured out in the industry, a more effective way to do that. I don't see why movies can't matter more. I don't think it's a permanent state of affairs, but that's my uneducated guess on the matter. And you may be listening to my rant and thinking of all the holes in it, since you know more about the topic than I do. But I don't think it's a permanent shift, and I don't think it is necessarily indicative of film as a medium, or I should say movies as a form being undervalued, so much as just, other things are, television and games are eclipsing them at the moment, just like, books, in many respects, statistically are starting to make a bit of a rise. I got another question from Candice Jean Ball, which kind of ties into, she had some questions above that. This kind of ties into George's question a little bit. Maybe this is the real answer to your question, George. Candice Jean Ball asks, how do you write for the digital attention span? Now, the digital attention span is something that I think is in some ways understated and in other ways overstated. So I read a book recently called Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport. It's not as good as his previous books, and it's kind of an interesting idea. Newport sort of suggests this thing called a digital detox. Well, he doesn't call it digital detox, but he suggests a thing like a digital detox. And anyway, you can look up digital minimalism and Cal Newport if you want. I'll link to all of these things in the show notes, by the way. A lot of this stuff. But writingthewrongway.com, you can go and you'll find links to these books and other things that I mentioned. But and of course, people ask me questions if they have websites or something. I'll direct you to them. But the digital attention span, I think, it gets a lot of attention in a negative manner. I think there's obviously negative aspects to it. But I also look at like binge watching. So, for example, when I was thinking of George's question, my initial response was, well, people don't have the attention span for movies anymore. But then I thought more about it. It's like, well, people watch 20 hours of Game of Thrones in a sitting. I don't think that it's necessarily the case that they don't have the attention span for a movie anymore. Although there's maybe something to be said for the inability to sit still and like cut everything else off. Because when you watch television, of course, it's a very distracted, non-immersive form of watching often. Even when people are binging things, I think, they're also doing other stuff at the same time. They're live tweeting it and so on. So I think like one issue is the digital attention span in terms of the movie question. But I think in a broader sense, you have like... I find this digital attention span to be a real problem in certain respects, but in other ways, you could argue for various strengths of it. Kenneth Goldsmith has a book called, I was blanking on the name of the book. It's over there. I should just walk over and look at it, I guess. But Wasting Time on the Internet, that's what it's called. Kenneth Goldsmith, Wasting Time on the Internet, is a set of essays about this very topic in a positive light. I think, maybe too positive, but if you kind of take the Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport and read that book, and then you take Kenneth Goldsmith's Wasting Time on the Internet and read that book, somewhere in between them is maybe where I might position myself. But Goldsmith, writes a lot about this digital attention span, this digital sort of method of thinking in terms of how it plays into reading and composition, as a writer. And it gets very much into some of the different, examples and different forms and different kind of experimental approaches that writers have taken to, dealing with this very question. So, Candice, when I see you next, I'll give you actually a copy of that book because I don't think I'm going to read it again. It's a very good book, but I don't know if I'll read it again. So I'll just give you my copy because I'm trying to get rid of books. I'm like trying to get rid of like 100 books or something. I just got way too many books right now. But anyway, my answer, I guess in short, would be go read Kenneth Goldsmith's Wasting Time on the Internet, and you'll see, there's like 100 and some ways you can. I think at the end he actually includes a list of like 100 ways to write for the digital attention span. My personal answer, though, like if you're asking me, like what do I do? How do I write for the digital attention span? I would say I write short. I write short poems, I write short scenes and stories. I write short stories. When I'm working on some big kind of novel projects right now. I just today actually got a grant to finish a novel project. But even so, my chapters are short. My scenes are short. I jump around from thing to thing a lot. I don't think it's necessary to do that. I just find that what I want to do is focus on a clear tension or a conflict and escalate it. So I do that in poetry. I do that in fiction. I try to find the clearest tension or conflict and then take it and escalate it and complicate it. So my sort of thing is I want to like hook a person in a sort of visceral manner, and then I want to just move the tension. I want to just increase the tension and increase the conflict. And I don't mean necessarily in terms of like plot development so much as like on a formal level. Like if you're reading a poem that I've written, I want to just start with a sort of interesting idea where it's going to be like a contrast or a tension. And then I just want to like take that and just keep increasing it and complicating it. So it's kind of hard to explain, but I think the answer in some ways is to grab the attention and then work to hold it. You grab the attention with a contrast, an attention, a conflict, even if it's just an abstract, set of tensions, or a formal tension. So I did in the first line of my new book, The National Gallery. The first line of the first poem is this: everyone in this poem was harmed. And I think like that's a line that interestingly it kind of grabs attention, and kind of presents a weird sort of contrast of ideas. One, it presents the idea of like everybody in this. It's sort of a reverse of course, no animals in this movie were harmed. No animals were harmed in the making of this movie. So I'm kind of swinging with like everyone in this poem as if, the poem had a cast of characters was harmed. All the animals that neared the poem were poisoned is the second line. Again, taking off on that kind of familiar warning or rather disclaimer. So I'm kind of opening the book with a disclaimer, but a sort of weird negative disclaimer, right? That's what I mean by attention. It's just sort of a thing it's going to immediately kind of throw you off balance a little bit. I try to just do that and then just keep moving upwards with it, keep throwing you further off balance, keep kind of taking the idea and increasing the tension of it or the strangeness of it. I write pretty unusual, strange stuff in many respects, but I try to use pretty straightforward techniques in terms of what I like to say I do is I write stranger fiction. And what I mean by that is even if I'm writing poetry, I think of it sometimes in these fiction terms. I try to take kind of avant-garde or experimental techniques and I apply them to genre content. So if I'm writing a short story, like I might write a horror story, with some sort of, but I'll take this kind of experimental, technique or approach. So it's my way of sort of subverting and revitalizing some of the maybe otherwise tired genre approaches. And in poetry, again, I'll take like a very kind of conventional idea, like a lyrical confession. And I'll just try to subvert, the certain aspects of it on a technical level. I think that's my answer to how to write for the digital attention span. I just just grab that attention as quickly as possible, from the first line of a poem or the first, few lines of a story. I just want that really conventional opening hook. And then I want to I feel like as long as you hook them, the reader, and you just escalate upwards, you can do anything else. I don't think you need anything in a story or in a poem other than escalation. I think everything else is optional and escalation is the rule. So that said, I'm not the most popular writer. So, take with a grain of salt. Like, I'm doing pretty unusual stuff that isn't necessarily easy to market. Marketing it is another question, right? Maybe ask Rupi Kaur what she does to write for the digital attention span. Again, the answer to some degree is you write short. I have one last question for you before I finish my whiskey and go to bed. One last question from Jean-Luc Baudry, who we like to call Frenchie around these parts. Jean-Luc Baudry asks, should Pringles come in a flat box instead of a boner-shaped can.